Listen, everybody, if your entire economic plan is hope the U.S. behaves, that is not a plan. That's a hope and a prayer.
And that's why Carney's heading to China this week, with India coming next. Whatever you think about those countries, the point is, when your biggest customer starts treating trade like a weapon, you don't sit there hoping that they calm down. You build options and leverage because paychecks, farms, and manufacturing jobs do not run on wishful thinking.
And yes, EV tariffs are right in the middle of all of this because Canada's trying to protect auto jobs and stop prairie farmers from getting crushed at the same time.
So by the end of this video, you'll know what Canada wants out of China, why India matters more than people realize, and what diversifying trade looks like when it's real, not just a headline.
So let's start with the China trip. Carney leaves today, arrives tomorrow, and stays a couple of days. He then heads to Qatar on January 18th and then Switzerland from January 19th to 21st to the World Economic Forum in Davos.
I love that. It's like, hello, Beijing. Yes, we have issues. Also, I'm really busy.
Now, I know some people are complaining that he's abroad too much, like he's doing a world tour just for the fun of it. Listen, he's not. He's trying to keep Canadian jobs steady while the U.S. turns trade into chaos. And you don't protect Canadian exports by arguing about it in the House of Commons. You protect them by being in the room where the decisions get made. So these meetings, they are about the domestic economy. It's farms, factories, jobs, and keeping Canada from being cornered.
But before we even get into the trade stuff, can we deal with the mini freakout happening over that Taiwan trip? The headlines and the Conservatives are acting like two Liberal MPs ran away in the middle of the visit, like it's some sort of dramatic betrayal. And you know what? It's not. The Taiwan delegation was planned way ahead of time. Carney's Beijing trip was only confirmed last week, and the overlap created a messaging mess. So the two Liberal MPs cut their trip short on government advice to avoid confusion. They also said clearly Canada's position on Taiwan hasn't changed. That's the whole story. But the Conservatives are trying to sell it like kowtowing because outrage is easier than reading the actual statement. Meanwhile, 3 Conservative MPs stayed and finished the itinerary, which is fine. But don't pretend the Liberals panicked when the actual reason was avoiding confusion during a Prime Minister's China visit that was confirmed late.
And the reason it's sensitive is obvious. China hates foreign politicians meeting Taiwanese officials, and Beijing treats that as interference. Whether we agree with that or not, that's how they play it. So Canada's trying to do 2 things at once. Keep informal ties with Taiwan steady, while Carney goes to Beijing to push Canada's economic interest.
So what is the goal in China anyways? Well, Canada is trying to protect farmers, protect auto jobs, and keep its foreign policy consistent. So the move is strong diplomacy because those meetings with President Xi Jinping are being looked at as a chance to recalibrate relations and look for economic opportunities.
And let's not pretend that this is some fresh little misunderstanding. Canada and China relations have been icy for years, ever since 2018 when China detained 2 Canadians after Canada arrested Meng Wanzhou in Vancouver under a U.S. extradition request. Now, this relationship has been strained, to say the least.
And even though the 2 Michaels eventually made it home in 2021, the relationship didn't magically reset. It stayed guarded, tense, and cautious, which is why leader-to-leader visits now is really a big deal. It's the first time a Canadian Prime Minister has made a trip to China since 2017.
And it's being watched super closely in the prairies because of the trade retaliations that is hammering agriculture, especially canola.
And listen, canola is not some niche hobby crop. It's massive. And farmers have been really getting hit hard by Chinese counter tariffs. One Saskatchewan farm leader estimated his operation alone was down about $450,000.
And here's where the internal tension shows up, because the reason we're in this mess, at least the latest chapter, are the EV tariffs. In 2024, Canada imposed a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles and 25% on Chinese steel and aluminum. We did it because the concern is China's massive subsidies and overcapacity basically flooded the markets at prices other countries can't compete with.
And we also did it in lockstep with the U.S. position at the time, trying to protect the integrated North American auto industry and reduce risks around connected vehicle tech.
So China responded by hitting Canada where it hurts. Agriculture and food exports, canola, seafood, pork. You want to get Ottawa's attention, you squeeze farmers and coastal industries.
So Carney goes into Beijing with two goals. One, reduce the pressure on Canadian exports like canola and seafood. Two, don't blow a hole in Canada's auto sector or in the broader North American trade relationship by looking like Canada is backing down on EV protections.
So you can see the political problem right there. Prairie premiers have been urging Ottawa to ease up so farmers can breathe again. Meanwhile, Ontario Premier Doug Ford is basically waving a stop sign and yelling, "Do not mess with the EV tariffs." But he's also saying if China wants to sell here, build a plant in Ontario. That seems fair to me.
Yeah, it does. But this is also where it gets complicated. The auto industry voices are blunt. Canadian vehicle manufacturers are warning that dropping those EV tariffs would be, in their words, incomprehensible and dangerous, especially with the North American trade deal renewal coming up.
Because the reality is this is what we're dealing with whether we like it or not. Canada builds cars as part of the North American system. The U.S. market matters and the U.S. rules still matter. And if Canada signals it's going to soften up on the Chinese EV imports, you can easily trigger a backlash south of the border. And that's exactly the thing we don't want to happen right now.
So Carney's walking into Beijing with the Canadian version of a tightrope. Protect auto jobs and supply chains, protect farmers, protect national security, and protect Canada's ability to make its own decisions.
And that last one, Dave, really matters because one of the smartest warnings in all of this came from Michael Kovrig, one of the two Canadians who were detained. His basic point was, sure, expand trade if you want, but don't trade away security, autonomy, and the ability to speak freely just to get economic relief.
And I know some people are going to be freaking out and saying recalibrate means cave. It doesn't. I think it means Canada is trying to do what the middle powers have to do to survive. Talk to everyone, keep your guard up, and build options.
Exactly. You can't isolate yourself from the second largest economy in the world and then act surprised when your farmers get squeezed and your exporters have fewer doors opening.
Also, Canada doesn't get to choose a world where the U.S. is predictable anymore. That's the whole point.
And that leads us to the bigger theme. The U.S. trade war posture is forcing countries to diversify whether they like it or not. And Canada's doing what we should have been doing years ago, except now it's really urgent.
So let's say this clearly. It's Canada reducing vulnerability. The government's message is that this Beijing visit is not a magic wand. It's building a foundation for ongoing talks because trade irritants don't vanish over a weekend.
Still, even the act of showing up matters. Leader to leader means unlocking channels that don't exist otherwise. That's what Carney's parliamentary secretary was saying. If you want any of this to move, you have to be in person at the table.
And this part is important. Canada can cooperate in some areas and draw hard lines in others. Agriculture and agri-food? Sure, talk. Investment? Talk carefully. National security? That's a hard boundary.
Which brings us back to the Carney angle. Competence. Not theatrics, but calm and measured diplomacy. You can support peace and stability in Taiwan, and you can keep your position consistent, and you can still go to Beijing to fight for Canadian jobs and farmers. The only people confused right now are the ones pretending that this is a scandal instead of a basic message of discipline.
And that helps us understand Canada's next move, Carney's upcoming trip to India. Because it's not just a China reset, it's multiple doors, remember.
India's High Commissioner to Canada is saying Carney will visit India in the coming weeks. And the theme again is trade diversification in response to U.S. tariffs.
And Canada-India relations have also been a mess recently. We all remember why. In 2023, the Trudeau government alleged Indian agents were linked to the killing of Sikh activist Hardeep Singh Najjar in Canada. The RCMP also accused the Indian government agents of being involved in serious criminal activity here, like extortion, threats, and even homicides.
India's government denied it and called the allegations absurd, and the relationship froze. And it's been deep and ugly and messy. But now we're seeing the thaw. The High Commissioner is basically saying the trust is back and the two countries are catching up after a gap.
He also made a political jab, saying there's a new prime minister and Canada is changing how it behaves, which, okay, that's his framing, but Canada's framing should be we need to defend our sovereignty and our justice system, period. And both can happen at the same time.
So this isn't pretending that hard stuff didn't happen. It did. But it's about doing what Canada has to do in a world where economic shocks are now a daily event.
Carney and Modi already met at the G20 in South Africa last November to launch negotiations towards a new trade deal, a comprehensive economic partnership agreement.
And that matters because India is growing. It's diversifying supply chains, and it's in a very different category than China for Canada. There's different risks and different opportunities.
Plus, India is also getting hammered by U.S. tariffs as well. So both Canada and India are dealing with Washington pressure at the exact same time, and that creates common interest.
And the sectors that are being talked about there are big-ticket Canadian areas, like energy, fertilizer, agri-food, innovation and research development, aerospace, and defense. This is where it shows that Canada is not powerless. Canada is not a victim here, and Canada has assets that people need. Food, energy, minerals, technology, skilled labor, and stable institutions.
Now, let's bring this back to the EV tariffs question, because that's the immediate pressure point with China, and it's also a window into Canada's bigger strategy.
There is no perfect outcome here. If Canada drops EV tariffs completely, we risk undercutting our own auto sector and angering the U.S. at a very sensitive time. If Canada keeps EV tariffs and refuses any flexibility, we risk prolonged pain for farmers and exporters.
And it's why the best Canadian frame isn't who do we love, it's how do we protect Canadians. Protect Canadian workers in auto manufacturing and parts, protect Canadian farmers and seafood exporters, protect national security, protect the ability to make independent policy without being shoved around by bigger powers. Wow, that's the whole puzzle.
And there's another angle here that people forget. Even if Canada wanted to rush into deeper economic ties with China, they still have constraints. There's security reviews, investment rules, technology risks.
Which is why this trip isn't likely to end with Carney walking out announcing, "We fixed everything." But what it can do is reopen channels, lower the temperature, and start negotiating relief where it is actually possible.
And if China wants access to Canada, it's reasonable for Canada to say, okay, build here, hire here, follow Canadian rules, and don't expect us to ignore risks just because you're offering cheaper products.
The point is to stop being trapped. If one relationship gets rocky, Canada needs other markets ready.
Because the world is not going back to the same era of rules-based diplomacy. So when the world gets rough, middle powers either build resilience or they get shoved around. You know what Canada's choosing? Resilience.
So right now, Canada is doing the uncomfortable work. We're talking to people we have history with. We're defending our interests. We're trying to keep jobs here, and we're trying to keep farms afloat. We're also refusing to get trapped in one market, one alliance, and one dependency.
Canada is making moves. The China trip, we have immediate pressure relief and stabilized dialogue. India trip, we have a long runway of diversification and strategic growth. EV tariffs, Canada's protecting manufacturing while trying to relieve pain in agriculture. And through it all, Canada is acting like a country that understands its own value.
Listen, it's your turn. If you had to pick Canada's top priority in these trade talks, what is it? Protecting auto jobs, protecting farmers, or building long-term independence from U.S. shocks?
There's a lot to choose from, so drop your thoughts in the comments. Keep it civil because, hey, we're Canadian and we can still argue politely while absolutely meaning it.
And if you want more of these Canada sanity checks, make sure to subscribe because in this era where we're being smart and steady is the real rebellion.
So we'll see you tomorrow, everybody. And if you want more, check out our Substack. All the links are below.
Thanks for watching. Ciao for now.